So the last speaker for this panel is Professor Tony Gallagher, who is professor at the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at the Queen's University of Belfast. His field of work is shared education, which involves collaboration between schools from different communities in divided societies, which is definitely something we need. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in the conference. I want to talk about some work we've been doing in Northern Ireland for around about 20 years or so around this idea of shared education. But first, just to give you a bit of context, Northern Ireland was and remains a very divided place. A lot of things that happen in Northern Ireland are still heavily influenced by the partition of the island in 1922. We still have many so-called peace walls dividing communities, particularly in Belfast. And politics remains with a very heavily denominational character in terms of political preferences and voting. So we remain a very divided society. And one of the clearest institutional manifestations of those divisions is provided by our school system. For historical reasons, we've always had separate schools for Protestants and Catholics. I won't go into the background to that. You could talk about that for forever. We still have a largely divided system. There is a small sector of religiously integrated schools, but as you can see in the figures there, there's a relatively small proportion of young people go to those schools. It's around about 7%. It's also worth noting from those figures that there is a degree of crossover because there are no formal barriers to participation across the different school types. So Catholics can, if they want, seek to go to Protestant schools, and Protestants can, if they want, go to Catholic schools, and numbers do. So there are no formal barriers, but we still have a largely separate system. During the years of the political violence, from 1969 to roughly 1999, a lot of people looked to the school system to do something to promote reconciliation. And there were four main strategies that were pursued during that period. Represented them here on the slide. The first area that was addressed and continues to be quite important is the development of common textbooks and common curriculums, particularly on subjects or areas which were difficult or controversial, like the teaching of history or the teaching of religion. Most recently, I suppose, an important initiative was the teaching of citizenship, because most of the normal facets of citizenship in normal societies are contested in Northern Ireland. So you can't just teach about the flag and the anthem and the system of government and the president or the queen or whatever, because every single one of those things is contested. So we had to develop a different sort of curriculum. In the 1980s, there was a lot of effort put into short-term contact programs, bringing young Protestant and Catholics together on joint holidays or joint project activities, joint school visits, and there's an awful lot of work put into that. In the early 1980s, and more particularly in the 1990s, we saw the development of the religiously integrated schools. As I say, they currently account for about 7% of the school-age population, and growth in that sector has stalled for a variety of reasons. And the fourth main strategy that was put in place in the 1990s was the provision of equitable levels of funding to Catholic schools, again for a variety of reasons. Prior to the late 1990s, Catholic schools received lower levels of funding than Protestant schools, but that was changed at that point as a formal matter of policy. So those are the strategies that were put into place. But in the context of the peace process, the ceasefires and the political agreement, there was an opportunity to look back over a lot of evidence that had been collected over those 30 years to see which of these strategies had been most effective. And to cut a long story short, our main conclusion was that while lots of good work had been done and lots of interesting projects had been carried out, there was little evidence of any real systemic change in the system. And something fundamentally different needed to be done if we wanted to try and work through education to sustain and underpin the peace process. There were a variety of reasons why all that work hadn't created any systemic change, and I've tried to reflect some of the main reasons for this on the slide. But I suppose in terms of the sort of discussions we're having here, the most important point, I think, is that if you want to rely on atomised projects that are short-term, then it won't make a real difference. If you want to make a difference in education, you have to think about sustainable change from the start. Trying to address these issues through education is not easy. There will be many mistakes along the way. There is no silver bullet that will solve the problem for you, and it takes a long time. These problems cannot be solved quickly, and so you've got to think of it in those terms, whereas all too often what we did during the years of surveillance was to think of it in terms of short-term projects, focusing on very specific elements rather than trying to deal with the bigger picture. In the context of the peace process, we had a major debate in Northern Ireland around the type of future society we wanted. And again, to cut a long story short, there were basically two positions that emerged from that debate. One view was that our differences were fundamental and they were acceptable. If people wanted to be different and to live separately, then they should be allowed to do that. And politics should be about trying to manage that process. There was another view, another camp, and I was very firmly in this second camp, which was that if we let difference flourish, we were simply building up problems for the future. Our current problems, I think, reflect that. We adopted a consociational model for our political structures, which have run into significant problems. The second camp argued that we needed to create a shared future. We needed to find ways of connecting institutions, connecting people in as many ways as possible to create a sort of rich interweave within society. With the people I was working with, we tried to think how that might be reflected in education, so we went back to first principles. For years, the debates in education had been, we had separate schools. These separate schools created institutional boundaries between young people. So should we leave these boundaries in place to acknowledge and reflect separate identities? Or should we remove the boundaries altogether to try and create common schools to promote a common identity? And that debate had got us nowhere. It had got quite fruitless and there was very little real energy left in it. So we tried to rethink some of the basic problems. Rather than thinking of schools as largely autonomous units, we tried to think of schools as a network system. And if you start to think about network systems, you start to think about the interdependencies between them. And we started to think about ways we could encourage positive interdependencies between the schools as a way of changing the relationship between the schools, and in that way using the civic institutions of the schools as a model of what a shared society in Northern Ireland might look like. And what that basically meant was leaving the borders in place but making them less important. And making them less important means making those boundaries porous and trying to create bridging processes between the schools so that young people could move between schools to take classes and teachers could move between schools to work with teachers in other schools in local areas, so that by changing the nature of the relationship between the students and the teachers and the parents, hopefully we would also make changes in the relationships between the communities. We started this work in the university in the first pilot programs with 12 schools in 2007. We ran a variety of pilot programs up to 2015. Two other organisations joined in along the way, a community organisation called the Fermanagh Trust and one of our education authorities, the North Eastern Education and Library Board. And the evidence we gathered focused on four main areas. First of all, there was the consequences of sustained regular contact as a matter of course. We wanted to have contact between young people in the schools happening as a matter of course. The new reality within schools is something that happened all the time. It was important that this linked into other educational priorities such as school improvement, so we've been looking at that as well. We also saw this as an opportunity for schools to share expertise, facilities and resources, and in that way making more effective use of facilities and the economic resources of schools. And more recently we focused on the role of networking and professional development as a way of creating sustainable networks of teachers into the longer term. The model we developed from this of what we think represents effective shared education or school collaboration in our context involves these 5 elements. 3 of them in some senses are important conditions to have. So it's important that there is sustained multi-level contact, as many lines of engagement between the schools as possible, because the denser the network, the more likely that those network of engagements will be sustained. One of the problems in the past is that work in this area in Northern Ireland around reconciliation was a peripheral activity, and the strategy had been to try to drag it from the periphery to the centre, and after 30 years it was still in the periphery. So we wanted to focus the shared education work, these shared classes, in core activities of the schools so that it was clear, explicit and visible to everyone in the schools and the school communities what was happening. This couldn't be seen as something that was happening on the edges of schools. It was something that was happening right at the heart of school activity. And it was important that it pursued multiple benefits, not simply the issue of social impacts or reconciliation. It also had to pursue school improvement and economic objectives as well. So all of those things were very important. The two most important factors we found in making collaboration work were the other two factors. And first of these was to trust teachers, to empower teachers. It had to be a bottom-up process. Teachers were the ones who were best placed to identify the particular challenges and the particular problems that had to be overcome in local communities in order to create effective collaboration. But we also looked to teachers as a source of ideas on how those problems could be overcome. And we were fortunate that we were supported by funders who gave us quite significant resources to try and make this work. So we were able to create a space for innovation, where we encouraged teachers to try out ideas that they had, and we didn't mind that much if some of the ideas they tried didn't work, because the only way you can create innovative solutions to new problems is by having some degree of tolerance of failure. It's the only way in which you can create new practice. In fact, one of the things we learned from the project was to abandon what is a very common principle within education, which is the principle of best practice. Because the principle of best practice assumes that for any given problem, someone somewhere has already solved it, and all you've got to do is to find what they've come up with, tell everyone to do it, on the assumption that if everyone does best practice, then everything should work out okay, and that hardly ever works out. Because many of the problems you're dealing with are novel problems, and what happens is that different people have different bits of the solution. The key is to join those dots and amplify what look like the most promising elements and try them, and if they don't work, figure out why and try something else. So that's what an innovative space is all about. But you need to empower teachers, you need to trust teachers and give them space to do that in order to create these innovative practices. Picking up an idea from the innovation unit in London, this is the principle of next practice. We think of it as best practice is a little bit like looking over your shoulder to what's happened before. Next practice is about looking over the horizon and trying to come up with new ways of doing things. The other consequence of that is our collaborative networks are all very different, because the context and the circumstances of them are very different. And this is something that we encouraged across the partnerships to learn their own distinctive ways of trying to achieve what they were trying to achieve. One of the consequences for the funders who gave us this work, or gave us the money to allow us to do this work, was they didn't just want an interesting project. At the start they said, we'll give you significant resources, will give you time to try and come up with an effective model for collaboration. But when you do that, we want you to change the entire education system. We don't want another project. We don't want a couple of useful papers and maybe an interesting seminar. We want you to change the education system in its entirety. So right from the start, we engaged with the politicians and the policymakers and the education authorities and all the different education interests within Northern Ireland in a specific attempt to try and ensure that they were aware of what we were doing and why we were doing it. One of the biggest problems in policy change in Northern Ireland is the idea of the hidden agenda. Whatever you say you're doing, people often assume there's some hidden agenda behind it and there's some hidden purpose that you're not telling them. So we tried to make it as difficult as possible for people to imagine there was a hidden agenda by bringing as many people as possible into the tent of shared education and to share that journey with us. And in 2016, the Northern Ireland Assembly passed a Shared Education Act, which made it a statutory duty on the Department of Education and the Education Authority to facilitate, promote and encourage shared education. So we started with 12 schools in 2007. Currently there are nearly 700 schools in Northern Ireland involved in this type of partnership activity, which is about 2/3 of the education system in Northern Ireland, and we continue to push that further forward because we want to get closer to 90%. This is important for a whole lot of different reasons. But it is important to say that education wasn't the cause of the Northern Ireland problem, and education will not solve the Northern Ireland problem. But as educators, we see ourselves as having a degree of responsibility to help do everything we can within the education system to try and move things forward. If you look at the population balances at the time of partition in the 1920s, where there was a very clear Protestant majority in Northern Ireland, that is no longer the case. It becomes even more important in a situation where the populations are in closer balance that we try to come up with an agreed solution to a shared future. Because if we don't, there's the risk that there will be a new majoritarianism if there's a Catholic majority who try to impose their will on Protestants, and we want to try and avoid that flip-over situation. What we're trying to do in the system at the moment is to spread this idea of networking as a way of doing things in as many different facets of education as possible, whether it's to do with community connections, leadership training for school principals, professional development systems are all centred around networking in local areas to try and create these connections between schools. So that the school system in Northern Ireland, which was often cited as a very clear illustration of our problem because it was separate, is now actually providing a model of a different type of shared and better future that's modelling the way for our politicians, if only they would listen, to see how things can be done differently. It's also worth saying, just in conclusion, that this model of shared education which was developed in Northern Ireland has been picked up and adapted, and it has to be adapted, it can't simply be applied as a template, in a range of other international contexts, including this city. We've been working with the municipality here in Jerusalem for the last 5 years, working with principals from Jewish, religious Jewish and Arab schools to try and explore how they can find ways of building collaborative models of shared education in their context. And we continue to support that work as best we can. Thank you very much.